Hi, Jamie.
Hello, Peter.
How you doing?
I'm okay. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Just came back from a family celebration, and those are always interesting. They bring out the best in people, probably the worst in me sometimes, but I'm always grateful for the time.
Yeah. I appreciated the picture that you shared with me. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, that's sweet.
It was sweet. It was really sweet.
That wasn't even staged. Obviously everyone's sitting and standing together with stage, but the two little ones who were on the ground, sort of like a Michael Jackson cover, they did that on their own. I thought that was adorable.
Yeah, that was great. It's summertime, and I'm getting to enjoy some of the summertime things that we normally do up here in Lake Tahoe, where we spend the bulk of our time. And those things are wonderful. We'll go to the lake today. So things could be worse, right?
That's right. My favorite book. Siempre se puede peor. I used to read that all the time to my kids. It could always be worse.
Deeply love it. I deeply love it. And we're going to talk about your conversation with Matt Hornbeck, a principal.
That's right.
So let's see. Can I say a couple things about this? One, I'm so grateful that you have a principal on. And it makes me say, hey, can I invite my principal friends to be on? Because you are way more connected in the superintendent world, but I've got plenty of principals to talk to.
This is a podcast called the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast. And while principals are in a lot of ways doing a lot of similar work to superintendents, a little different. And so I would say, sure, if you've got a principal who really is thoughtful of the systems work that they're doing, then they fall under the leadership part of the podcast. I can't wait to share with you Matt Hornbeck's conversation, things like restorative practices and the work that he's done. He's a principal of a charter school, and I know I have from time to time said things that maybe show I am suspicious sometimes of charter schools, and his leadership at his charter school in Baltimore City really shows how wonderful and how purposeful a system can be when it holds charter schools to the same standards as it does its other public schools, while also embracing some innovative things. So giving them some of the ability to do some things differently, while at the same time knowing that Matt will hold on to every kid. This is not about gaming a system or changing a system or competing with an existing system. It is, how can we complement and learn from each other and with each other? And that to me seems pretty awesome.
We're about to listen to it. Listeners, listen for this description of restorative practices. I'd say it's one of the best I've ever heard. It's spectacular. It's really clear. The impact is clear. The quantitative measures of its impact are clear. The qualitative process that they use is clear. I just loved it. I thought, he could do this. He could do this for a living. This man knows what he's talking about, because it's so good. It's really good. It may be one of my favorites I've ever heard.
Let's get into it. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
I'm Jamie Mansan.
And we will see you in a few minutes. Alrighty, here we go. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Matt Hornbeck is my guest. Matt is an established leader in Baltimore, Maryland. Before becoming a principal at Hampstead Hill, a Baltimore City charter school, he was an educational consultant with large urban districts on resource allocation and principal training. And he holds a master's degree in educational administration as well as a law degree. He's the son of a former superintendent. His father was Maryland State Superintendent and then later served as superintendent of the Philadelphia Public Schools. Matt, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you, Pete. So glad to be here.
Matt, I'm sure I was curious to talk to you maybe as a way to help figure out how damaged my own children might have been knowing that their father was a superintendent. But it looks like you've survived okay. You've even thrived. So that's exciting.
I think it's a bonus. I think your kids will be great.
I hope so. Certainly more resilient.
Yes.
As I learned more about you, though, I found a 2018 Baltimore Sun project called Roughly Speaking, where they asked principals, you being among the 5 that were interviewed, what it was like to run a Baltimore City school. And at that point, you were in your 15th year. In that conversation, you talked about a number of core components to successful schools, one being the benefits of incorporating restorative practices in your school. I wonder, for those who are listening who may not be familiar with restorative practice, can you talk a little bit about that? And then particularly on the spectrum of restorative practices, there's something called a restorative conference. And I'm kind of curious if you wouldn't mind describing one that you had been a part of.
Of course. Thank you, Pete. And thanks for this podcast and all you do to highlight such important issues to students, staff, and families and superintendents, because talking to practitioners is so important and you are in it. And so I appreciate that. In terms of restorative practices, I'll start with saying that all schools and districts usually have the word joy in their mission statements. And joy is something hard to put your finger on and manufacture. And I think that our implementation over the last now 18 years of restorative practices, this is my 20th year here, is really a key component of why there's joy at our school. And we have about 900 students and 100 staff members. It is the difference between having people want to come to work, want to come to school, and not want to come to work and not want to come to school. When you implement restorative practices well, and adults and students feel seen and heard, which is the whole point of restorative practices, then attendance goes up and tardies go down. And I think achievement is directly linked to all of that as well. And we really have succeeded with that and have a very mature implementation of restorative practices. It's sort of like Charlie Brown's teacher, which, if you recall from way back when, didn't have a voice. Kids are always asked, why'd you do that? Why'd you do that? And it just sounds the same from every adult to every kid, whether they're 5 or 15 years old. And with restorative practices, we train staff to ask 3 questions. And well, first, let me start by saying on the continuum that you mentioned, Pete, first you start with doing a lot of community building circles. We do those at least 3 times a week, and we have circle logs that teachers turn in. We share questions between the 29 homerooms, and could be a simple question, just what'd you do this weekend, or what are you going to do this weekend? Could be what's your favorite color or candy bar, that kind of stuff. We model it in our faculty meetings, and we say, tell us a teacher you remember and why, or what's your favorite Thanksgiving food, or, whatever it is. And it builds community and creates those connections between people and kids. And then we're trained to ask 3 questions when there's conflict. And there's always going to be conflict. City Hall, central school, district headquarters, school, there's going to be conflict wherever. Whether it's mean girls in middle school, whether it's somebody knocking somebody's notebook out of their hand, something on recess, there's going to be conflict. And so that should be part of the expectation. And the way that restorative practices works and is so successful, we get the parties together and say, get the kids together. What happened? So both sides get to tell their story. She wouldn't let me come to her birthday party. He posted something on Insta, whatever it is, that's the conflict. And the other side says, we used to be friends and she won't let me sit with her at lunch, or whatever the conflict is. And adults have very similar conflicts, as you know, Pete, from working with people at the level that you worked for so many years. And then the second question is, who was affected? And building some empathy. Your mom's going to be affected because she's not going to like it when I call home and talk about the rough day you're having. The teacher's affected because they can't get through the lesson that they had planned. And you're affected because you're not in class. You're sitting here talking to me. And build some empathy, right? And they kind of go through that. And kids of all ages can kind of get that. And the third question is the magic. The third question is the one that really is the being seen and heard piece of this. What do you need to move on? And what you need to move on can be simply, I just wanted to say what happened, or I'd like my locker moved, or I'd like my cubby moved, or I'd like to sit somewhere else at lunch, or I'd like to participate in a lunch bunch if I'm a little kid so that I can kind of hang out with somebody because I'm stressed about the social aspects of recess or lunch or whatever. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to be with other kids in a small group, enjoying, each other's company. That is, if we do that over and over and you build community with these circles, and then you have these restorative conferences where it can be serious matters as well. There could have been a fight. And let me be clear that restorative practices is not a substitute for the more traditional consequences. It is a supplement that dramatically reduces suspensions and office referrals and detentions and all those metrics that superintendents and principals are faced with, numbers, the demographic data behind those numbers and the stories behind those numbers. Restorative practice is very good at reducing those numbers. But if there's been a fight and somebody is coming back after a one-day suspension, and there's a restorative conference, and we have our detention set up for middle school students so that it's restorative. There's some coaching on, what happened, what could you do differently. There's a little protocol that the people who staff detention would go through. Same with a return from suspension. We may certainly have an administrator, and a parent, but we may have 2 or 3 students there together who had conflicts in the previous day or previous week. We may have teachers there. We have counselors. There have been times when we'll have school police officers with us. And again, that format is talk about what happened, who was affected, what do you need to move on. Sometimes there can be a contract written, letting the adults know that everyone is aware of everything that's happening and on the same page, and that everyone needs to be pulling in the same direction in terms of there's basic fundamental agreement around why kids are at schools. And almost all adults agree on that if they have some time to think about it and they're not in the middle of a very challenging circumstance. You mentioned describing a particular conference. And one that comes to mind is last spring, there were 2 girls who had a lot of conflict, ongoing conflict, kind of cumulative conflict. They were irritating each other. They were bumping into each other, giving each other, a look that alarmed and upset the other one. Their friends were egging them on. This kind of what you can imagine from either movies or your own memories of middle school. If you're not in the public education business, what happens in middle school at times, very cliquey. So we worked with them for a while. We tried all the interventions and kind of conferences with each kid and decided to have a large restorative conference in the library. And both sets of parents came, both girls came, our director of restorative practices came. I was there, an assistant principal was there, and we went through that protocol. And once the girls got to explain to each other in front of their teachers and administrators and parents what was happening, and you couldn't kind of hear the half-truths or misunderstanding that happens when you are talking to someone one-on-one, then it gets real quick. And the girls came together and really, really felt good about the outcome. And for the rest of that school year and this school year, which is their 8th grade year, there have been no conflicts between those 2 students. And that community that's built because of that process is an important part of our success. And a little to bury the lead, we just had, for the first time since the pandemic, test scores were released yesterday. And Hampstead Hills Middle School is the top performing school in our district in reading and math. And our elementary school is the 3rd highest in reading and 7th highest in math. And we are a neighborhood school that's not selective. And we have just an amazing teaching staff. So student performance, all of the consequence metrics like detention, suspension, and office referrals and attendance all move in the right direction, in my opinion, when a school leader or a district leader fully embraces restorative practices.
Thank you so much for that example. I will tell you that there are so many that I've talked to around the nation that are struggling, particularly post-pandemic, with discipline. And the traditional model of punishing and suspending only brings back the same kind of behaviors that were there beforehand. And so restorative practices really provides you a way to disrupt that cycle and really dig in and build meaningful relationships, because people don't hurt the people that they love. And particularly with school, I can use that word love because they really do care deeply for the people around them if they also feel valued and honored. And so I really appreciate the example.
Yeah, well said.
In the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension called leaders learning work. And that's really the mind of an organization's work. And inside that dimension is a term, supporting resilience. And so in learning more about you, I have really seen that resilience is an essential part of your work in your school and in the Baltimore City schools as a whole. I think about a program that you have championed called Leaders Go Places, where children contribute to the common good, they persevere, and a number of other components. What does resilience look like in your school?
A lot of people in the education field, Pete, talk about grit, perseverance, resilience, these sort of education buzzwords that are popular today. And it's very challenging to say you need more grit or you need more perseverance or you need to, just get her done kind of. And that doesn't really give the lay of the land to an adolescent or to a 6-year-old or 7-year-old that's struggling. I think that you
think they say, I'll take some hot Cheetos and actually, can I get a small grit? No, make it supersize that. I'll take a large.
That's right. No one's going to order the extra large perseverance serving. And it's hard work. And I think that as adults in the building, we have to show them and model what perseverance looks like and highlight it. And one of the things that we're big on, and this is just an example, but is writing, because it's such a synthesis of skills that you need for the rest of your life. And so writing takes a number of drafts, right? You don't just sit down, and life is not a tweet. And so you definitely need to be able to communicate in writing, and having drafts and using technology like Google Classroom to be able to see in real time the editing process. That's an example of something where kids give up. They will, whether it's on a test or a writing assignment or an art project, I'm not good at writing, or I can't draw, or whatever it is. And I think that when leaders go places, which is really an extension of our restorative practices work, where students gather weekly, all 300 of our middle school students gather weekly and come together, and they thank each other and apologize to each other and their teachers for things that have happened the previous week, which is just so heartwarming to see. And they do review the promises and how they apply to their lives. And they do know how to calculate their GPA, and they do have attendance and behavior count towards making achievement level of bronze, silver, gold, or platinum. And they do have community service requirements in order to become a leader at any level. And almost 8/10 of our students each quarter make level. And then we are highlighting people who make it for the first time, when that might be third quarter. So we definitely have created delayed or deferred gratification, right? When you're little, you need that little snack or whatever it is, treat, M&M, Skittle, to just say, okay, just do this one more time. Hit that ball across the net to me, or shoot that basket one more time, or try those 5 math problems, and then we'll give you an immediate treat. The cycle we're on in the US is just such a short attention span. We've all lost focus. And whatever you want to call it, grit, perseverance, or focus, or delayed gratification, we're trying to extend to create planners and dreamers and people who are planning for the future. And hundreds of our kids are first generation American, and hundreds of them will be first generation college bound when they go. And having a sense of, okay, what am I going to do in high school, college, and beyond? And that I'm not thinking about just being 18, but I'm thinking about being 30 or 40, or, growing up, and what do I want to do? I think that perseverance is a much broader discussion than just, go do this multi-layered task. Now, we have those, like portfolio projects are another example of, and every student in our middle school participates in National History Day, which, you talk about perseverance, that is really getting kids ready for high school and college. And it's not just the highest performing kids that participate in National History Day. Every student here does. And getting each other, being part of a team, relying on other people. All of those traits need to be modeled, and then someone will describe you as a person who can persevere after you achieve. But just saying that I persevere, like we started with, you can't order it up in a large, medium, or small.
Matt, what does the term an imperfect leader mean to you? How does that resonate?
I think it's a genius move on your part to name a podcast An Imperfect Leader, because I think it's just a fact that leaders are not perfect, and that they are fallible, and that those of us in leadership positions at whatever level, need to show vulnerability and openness to discussion, and try to lead with consensus and humanity, and try to create space and place for each other and the people that we work with to be in the work and set the priorities and get everything done that needs to get done. Because you can't write down in a job description what a teacher should do on a daily basis. I mean, you can on some level, but the thousands of decisions that are made each week in a homeroom by a first year or a 10th year teacher are nothing short of extraordinary. Teachers are heroes. And I think of myself as a talent manager more than a school leader, and as a snowplow principal to get everything out of the way so that the teacher can get his or her job done. And when I think of an imperfect leader, I think it's somebody I think there's leaders that, unfortunately, you got a range, right? Just like anything, there's a continuum. You got those people who are capricious and arbitrary. And I honestly believe people leave managers, not jobs. And so you're going to see high turnover. You're going to see dissatisfaction, low outcomes, or suppressed outcomes at whatever level they're working at. And then you're going to have the people who are a little bit more command and control, a little bit more, maybe they're insecure and it comes off in a leader as too forceful or too, my way or the highway. And I'm telling you to do this. And because of my title, I think you have to do it. And that is a very stressful situation for the leader and for the staff at district or school level. And then you've got what I think an imperfect leader implies, which is you can be a leader and be vulnerable. You can, in fact, be the most effective leader and be vulnerable. And that is, I think, the only way to be effective is to let people connect and the retention of your top performing teachers is the whole game. And so you've got to create the conditions, especially in these times right now, and teachers are not paid what they should be paid. You've got to create the conditions that teachers want. And among those is respect and being seen and heard and open communication. And then when you mess up, you've got to say, yeah, that was a mistake. We'll do that differently next time. But you've got to be able to own any challenges, and ultimately saying you're sorry to a parent, a kid, or a teacher is the way to a much better future and a much better path for the kid. And that's certainly, apologies are free. And I think that if you mean it, and people know if you mean it or not, if you mean it, then you are really going to make a difference and put the resources. Because as a superintendent, you and as a principal, we're in a position to allocate time and money and people to solve problems. And if that's being done equitably and with a sense of justice, and not everyone getting exactly the same thing, because that's not what we're talking about, but people getting what they need, then that's a big deal. And there's always going to be excuses. But I think the vulnerable leader, the imperfect leader, is going to, instead of offering excuses and defensiveness, is going to say, let's move forward and let's get this work done together. And I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, but together, the sky's the limit.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being. And I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of an Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest is Matt Hornbeck, principal of Hampstead Hill in Baltimore, Maryland. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision they had to make, and then we discuss it. Matt, what happened?
Thank you, Pete. So one of the things when I thought about this podcast and thinking about a time when I made a decision that wasn't necessarily, in hindsight, the best decision, early on in my tenure, I was really struggling with staff attendance. And a school this size usually has about 550 days a year, that days each school year that we need coverage. And what I mean by that is there's 180 student days, but often there's 2 or 3 staff members out and we on a given day. And so there's 550 school days when we need to provide coverage. And since the pandemic, it's gone up to about 850 days. And that doesn't include coverage for IEP meetings or student support team meetings, or if someone needs to leave early because their own daycare has called and their own child is sick. But just hundreds and hundreds of days of coverage are needed. And it's very difficult in any district, in any school, as you well know, to provide coverage and to not split up classes and combine classes when you are short-staffed. But there is nothing worse than having 5 or 10 kids added to your class at the last minute during homeroom if you're a teacher and the principal walks by and says, "How many can you take?" And that's just a disaster of a day and results in those teachers actually taking more mental health days shortly thereafter. So it's a vicious cycle. One of the things that happened here was that in our district, you can only take a half day or whole day of leave. And so if if a teacher said, I need to leave at 1 o'clock for an appointment, would you like me to leave at 11:30, take a half day? Or would you like me to just stay and work until 1 and then leave at 1? And then I basically have to mark them present for the whole day. And so I was getting clobbered on that because, it's just human nature. Nobody was doing anything necessarily malicious, but the appointments were being made in the afternoon hours and people would just leave early. Well, what I decided to do and make an agreement with staff, and it's worked out very well for us, is keep track of late arrivals or early departures. And the way the district had it planned out wasn't working. And the way that I was trying to appeal to altruism was not working. And I was just trying to follow the rules and it wasn't working for us. And so the way I tried to reflect and adjust to what was happening was to keep track of early departures and late arrivals so that if a teacher needed 3.5 hours of, hey, I got to leave at 2 o'clock to go deal with the cable guy, or I've got to leave at 1 o'clock to go deal with, somebody in my family sick and I have to get them to the doc, then we keep track of that. And if it doesn't add up to a half day, we don't take any time. But if it adds up to a half day, when it adds up to a half day, we take that. And all of a sudden, when it was up to the teacher to take their time and we were keeping track of it, then all of a sudden the appointments started to be made in the later afternoon after school. And that turned out to be a good thing for kids in learning. I think being creative and seeing the conditions on the ground is part of the challenge for district and school leaders, and feeling like you can come up with a solution that works and defend it if the district asks, and that sort of your reasonable teacher will get it is a key piece of my work. And that's just one example of how we do it here at Hampstead Hill.
So I'm curious about this because often a school will be told, look, we have procedures and this is how it works. And your teacher is out of the building, you haven't marked them out necessarily, and then something happens and all of those types of, the greatest fears are what are presented to principals and why you can't do things. And it sounds like you have found a way to do that. What were you learning, or what did you learn about relationships when you made this shift from a very restrictive and absolute adherence to a rule and found a more flexible approach to honor the people in your building? What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
It's interesting. I kind of was not mentioning it to supervisors and district staff for many years because it was working and it was sort of a hush. And it's become such an effective tool for us over the last 12 or 15 years that I've told other principals about it and told district staff about it. And, I'm open with it about the union, and it works for us. I think that ultimately superintendents and principals and leaders in general are, I don't know about often, but frequently put in the position of having to make a decision and apologize later and go ahead and do something that makes sense at the school level. So much of what we have to do at the school level is a construct, right? Because we're given the policies, we're given what the school board and the state board have decided is the best curriculum, the best policy, the best procedure. And then we have to make sense of it. We're given the code of conduct, and the devil's in the details, and how you implement things with humanity and fidelity is very important. And happy workforce, happy teacher, happy life is a good mantra for a principal or a superintendent. And this just made sense as a way to have a win-win where we had more instructional minutes overall and some rhyme or reason to there's a lot of favoritism at schools, Pete, as you may well know. And, hey, if you do me this favor and cover this lunch shift and then you need to leave early, I'm not going to take time out. I'm not going to take time from you for that. And I think that if you're a consistent manager, it's treating everybody the same on that kind of.
Yeah, you've standardized what had been sort of a underground, you rub my back, I'll rub your kind of thing. And you were making it above board to say, let us know when you need support and we'll find it for you.
Yes.
I'm thinking about the question I typically ask about what got overlooked. And it seems to me that from a system level, so not just at your building, but at a system level, what's getting overlooked is this absolute adherence to a procedure that's been put in place. And I use procedure different from policy because I think policies often leave things very generalized, and then someone interprets it from the district level and creates a procedure. But you said from the very beginning, what it was doing was increasing the number of days of individuals being absent. And we certainly know post-pandemic, there are more people taking sick days because there's been a sort of a stabilizing or a review of, look, I'm not going to drag myself in there if I'm sick. It does anybody any good. And so I'm actually going to stay home if I'm sick. The piece that really spoke to me or resonated for me was the splitting up of classrooms. If you're in an urban or metropolitan district, and to some degree in rural districts, I'm sure, when you don't have a teacher and there is no substitute, you split up the classroom, and that fundamentally changes the day for everyone, for the children whose teacher is absent, as well as the teacher who now has welcomed 10 new students back into their room. And so I'm wondering, from this very long-winded question in terms of what got overlooked, is that how might the original plan or procedure have sort of solved a problem, but didn't really think about the instructional needs of children, and how your solution really built in a better pathway so that more predictably, children could expect that their teachers would be there?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, and it's somewhat of a rhetorical question, because I think that one of the challenges that school leaders have is what you would call bleed time, and where minutes creep away. And if you've got, for example, as you know, if you have a chronically absent student and then you have a teacher who is absent a lot in a given year, they are not absent on the same days. And if the kid's absent 3 weeks and the teacher's absent 3 weeks, that's actually 6 weeks, a month and a half, without the teacher and the kid together in the room. And so it exacerbates the neediest students, the challenges that the neediest students face. And I think that it is true that if you've got a procedure that's not working, that is not working at the ground level for practitioners, that having leaders who can make game day decisions or implement long-term practices or procedures like this one are a great example. And just to piggyback off of that, one of the things early on that happened was that the prior administrator who worked here for 11 years prior to me was effective, but had a kind of traditional favorites, and no one was marked late in the morning. And so when I started, some of the teachers were walking in with the kids and, past the contractual obligation to be here 15 minutes before kids. And certainly things were not jumping an hour or an hour and a half before kids got here. And one of the things I did was start to mark people late at 5 minutes before kids got here. Boy, some of the people really didn't like that. They thought I was not treating them as professionals. And I said, you can't arrive 5 minutes before the kids get here. You haven't taken your jacket off. And then the next year, in my third year, we did it at 1 minute past the time that they were contractually obligated to be here. Now, what that does, I felt, in hindsight, it seems trivial, but it was a very difficult thing to do with the entrenched way of doing things that had been in place. And what it does is gets not just the handful of people, because it's a very small group of people who are late every day. It has everyone who comes on time aware that I recognize that they're doing not just what they should do and what they can do, but what's good for kids. And then I'm handling the other challenges.
Yeah, you were focused on compliance rather than a more appreciative lens of, so why is it that teachers come early? Or,
Right.
What do children get out of a prepared teacher? Or whatever it is, the way that you frame it, because I'm not sure, but it is that is such a tale of all of us who have in our early leadership, is that we fall prey to compliance over having those conversations, or as a community, how do we want to be with each other? What do we want for children? And how do we establish this cultural field that makes us all proud to be here, as opposed to you standing at the door monitoring the parking lot about when people arrive?
Yeah. And we even went so far as I would put a red dot, and boy, they didn't like the red dots. And so, I'm sorry, it was a red L. And so they didn't like L.
Scarlet L.
Scarlet L. Oh, it was really intense. And so I said to them, to the handful of people, it's only 6 or 7 people out of 70 teaching staff. I said, what would you want? And they said, how about a green dot instead of a red L? So I'm like, done. Let's do the green dot. And then I don't worry about it, don't think about it, don't talk about it. until the mid-year conference and the end of the year conference. And then if it's 2, 3, 4 times, whatever, man, parking was difficult. It's the same as being perfect. I don't make a big deal about perfect. Perfect attendance to me is the same as, a handful of days later absent. And then if it's 15 or 20 or 30 days, then let's get that going in the other direction. But it's not something that I have to worry about every day. It's not dominating the conversation. You don't have to worry about me fussing at you on a given day. And I changed my pattern from those early days to set something up in August that is tenable and enforceable and doable from what we've got going on here. And it has improved, along with restorative practices, along with being a talent manager, having a talent manager mentality, along with not handing people one ream of paper each month that they have for the copy machine, but buying them paper for copies. It's got kind of basic fundamental needs of teachers. That kind of approach has a lot of respect between labor and management. And that you hit the nail on the head again there, Pete, by saying that great things can happen. It's a synergy that happens when you have a relationship as opposed to a set of procedures or rules. That relationship is going to produce far more. I could not, for the life of me, get people to coach basketball or do the volleyball team or the debate team or these things. But when I did this simple thing, and I just was killing myself trying to beg staff members to take on these out of the classroom roles. And when I said, let's just write down everything so I can celebrate it with you, and we're going to call it student life contributions. And I want you to keep track of that on a Google Doc and print it and bring it to the mid-year and the end of the year. And then I can say, oh my gosh, thank you so much. And if somebody hands me a blank sheet of paper, I say, oh, there's all these opportunities. Go be you can put things on there. I went to the school play. I went to the basketball game. Just go see the kids play. And you don't have to do anything except go celebrate with them. And yet you're then contributing to student life. And so that is another example of change that was needed because what we were doing wasn't working. And it let people play off of each other and really connect with each other. And great things can happen when you do that.
You mentioned students seeing their teachers at a basketball game. I'll elevate it to the central office level for a superintendent. Your community sees you at those football games, basketball games, school plays. They see you showing up at a Saturday relay race for cancer. They see you when they are giving their time. And it really elevates, it gives you a sense of what's happening in your district and gives you such great pride. You almost get to be the town crier wherever you go around the state and around the nation to say, these amazing things that are happening in my district. And at the same time, for the people who work with you and for you, they feel a sense of pride because they are seen. And so I like the idea of not overburdening, because there's something about burnout. Being seen at everything means that you're not being seen by your families and those who love you. There is real value, though, in the roles that we play in public education to be seen by our communities. Matt, what advice might you give to a new leader?
Be patient, be in it for the long run, see and hear your staff, and try to connect with people and be consistent, and don't have favorites, and ask questions, and think of yourself as support, not as the center of attention. I think that everybody thinks that everyone thinks that their supervisor thinks about them a lot more than the supervisor actually thinks about them. And I know that because I do that with my supervisor, and everybody here is always thinking about, what am I thinking about them? And as humans, we're just very egocentric. And I think that try to make yourself not the center of attention, but your support. And you've got phenomenal resources at your disposal. And just think about what students and teachers need and the content they need to make the future brighter for all of us. And that's a lot of advice, but it's easier said than done. But I don't think that central office, unless you're the superintendent, is necessarily a step up. Be careful about thinking that it's a promotion to come out of the classroom. Find the place where you can thrive for decades in a classroom and get really good at what you're doing and value that, because there's nothing more important.
My guest again was Matt Hornbeck. And Matt, as you know, this podcast was designed for aspiring new and established leaders. And In the leadership model that I talked about earlier, there's a dimension called nested patterns, and that really speaks to the way that individuals behave. The hope is that these habits, become like a muscle, like muscle memory. One term in there is growth mindset. And I'd been somewhat of a fixed mindset on who gets to participate or who would participate on this podcast. And I'm so glad as a principal that you agreed to share your time and your treasure. And so thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pete. I really appreciate the opportunity.
So we're back. What's your, I want to open with a question. Do I always open with a question?
I think I really appreciate it. I think it sets the tone for the rest of our time. So go for it. What's your question, my friend?
I actually want to start with one of the first things he talked about, and that was this concept of, basically, it was leading into the restorative practice description, but he talks about how every system has something about joy that opens its mission statement, its vision statement, whatever. And in fact, my organization, APC Leadership Collaborative, our tagline is coaching district leaders so students experience success and joy at school. That's ours. So joy is literally in it. And it made me go, first, how have you used joy? How has that shown up in your own leadership? And secondarily, how do we measure this? How do we know whether that's occurring? And I want to say something about Matt. I think he's really trying to. He's really trying to figure out, is this a joyful place? But I'm interested in your thoughts on those two things. A, how has that shown up in your own experience, joy, and in your leadership experience? And then second, how do we measure it?
First of all, I would say that not all system leaders think that joy ought to be one of the values, or don't even, that's maybe not fair. It isn't the first thing that they consider.
Yeah.
In fact, sometimes you get the lifelong learning line, and that usually makes me want to do something unjoyful to myself and others. Joy. As you know, I always begin.
New Yorker in you. Every time it comes out, I'm like, oh, there it is.
When I work with others, I always insist that they share with me what their values are, their personal values, in part so that I understand who they are, in part so that I know whether or not my values are consistent or at least complementary to theirs, to see if we can do work together. When I share my values, as you may remember, Simcha, Tzedakah, Mitzvah, Shalom, right? Simcha is my Hebrew name, and the word is joy. It means joy. And so for me, when you ask me, how does it manifest in the work that you do and your interactions with others, I don't always do it well, but my job when I am working with people is to find joy in it for myself, certainly. And even more importantly, that I serve them, that I can bring joy for the work, for our time together, that they find joy and that light. And, you'd have to ask the people who work with me, although I would say they probably are like, joy, I don't know, demanding probably is what's probably, maybe he's confused by those words. However, I like to laugh, I like to joke, I like to have fun, and I hope that my actions yield joy. I was inspired by Matt because he's intentional about not just saying, oh, that's great, that's your individual goal. This is our organizational goal. Is that we want there to be joy in classrooms, in schools, in interactions with others. And I probably didn't answer your question really well. However, joy certainly is important to me.
I think you answered it very well. I enjoyed that answer. What I think is missing from the answer is the measurement part. And I want to make the link to the restorative practices conversation. And I do want to read a little bit of the transcript of what he said.
Please.
Because it was so good. But his measure is about, basically, do kids come to school and have a positive experience, both socially and then more specifically academically, having even shared during this episode his scores, the test scores that came out and showed the high performance of his particular school. So I think those are two everybody sort of knows those as measures. The way he measures it, though, I think, and this goes to restorative practices, is he measures it based on their ability to navigate conflict. And what I love about this as a measure is it's less about the big picture stuff, right?
Yes, I avoided it. Jamie, I avoided that part of it because I thought what I was going to say was going to be exactly what you would expect any person to say. What metrics can we look at? Well-being and survey data and focus groups, those kinds of things. And I couldn't say that with a straight face. I don't have an answer. And so I think that's probably better.
This is why his answer is so great. His answer is there is going to be conflict. First, he says there's going to be conflict in any human interaction. Very true. My favorite, as a middle school guy, as a middle school person, that's who I am. I am still 12. He says you have to expect in middle school, there's a ton of conflict, constant conflict. And I'm like, oh, I love this. Exactly. And he measures whether or not they navigate all of that conflict. Do the kids feel better as a result of the restorative practices process that they're using? So he says, I'm sorry to be sort of constant on this, but he says this. First of all, he describes our traditional process of dealing with conflict and discipline like Charlie Brown's teacher. And so those that are my age or older know this as the wah, wah, wah sound. Like basically a trombone with a mute. So good. And he said, so if we keep asking over and over, why'd you do that? And they don't have an answer. And then they go through the basics of the questions. He says there are 3 questions that they ask. They ask what happened, who is affected, which builds empathy. And then he said, this is my favorite part. He said, the 3rd question is the magic. The 3rd question is the one that really is the being seen and being heard piece of this process. What do you need to move on? What do you need to move on can be simply, I just wanted to say what happened, or more specifically, I'd like my locker moved, or my cubby moved, or can I sit somewhere else at lunch? I love honestly, if I can describe it as his joy in that question.
It's joy. I would say it's also honesty.
Yes.
In that, and maybe pragmatism, in that not every interaction is going to end with a bow and a rainbow and a hug, and there can be continued conflict. So what do you need to move on can be a technical change that will yield peace. And then to go back to their process, because I highlighted this too, is that the process involves starting with that extensive community building circle conducted at least 3 times a week. And so I can imagine the goals of the school is to continue to have the tension that exists between 2 people, while what do you need right now to move on has been maybe a separation, is to slowly bring back to try to restore what has been broken. It doesn't all have to be done as if it's like a sitcom in a 30-minute kind of thing, which I think sometimes we do as leaders. We insist, even when it's individuals of our same age or same status, we try to resolve it so quickly to be like, are we good? We're good. We're good. We're done. We're good. Great. Things aren't always so good immediately. It's going to take time to rebuild trust and all those kinds of things that, go into a meaningful and real, genuine relationship.
We've talked about this particular thing that leads to this other comment he made. He says, and you 2 were laughing about it. He says, no one's going to order an extra large serving of perseverance. What a great quote.
Oh my God.
I love this quote.
Supersize.
Exactly. And I'm like, no one does. Those 3 meetings a week over and over is systemic trust. You're building a system of trust with the students and large. Now, within that system, people are going to do what they do. So there's not going to always be, the system isn't always going to hold all of those people. They're going to be individual conflicts, but the process is more likely to work if you've already built that system of trust, right? There's a net underneath this individual conflict that you then navigate. You say, okay, what do you need to move on? And then you go back to building trust. The building of the trust is the perseverance. This is what I've said this a million times. That is called discipline. You have discipline. This is I keep talking about this over and over, and how I'm so frustrated that we call these consequences for students discipline. It's not discipline. That's consequence. It's a different thing. Discipline is about practice. And to be honest, the people who are worst at this are adults. We're terrible.
That's the thing. We want it resolved immediately. And yet, here's the thing that was sort of, I sometimes bristle when people say, here is my aha. Here was my aha, though.
Yes.
Was that in academics, we model what perseverance looks like all the time. And he cited writing with multiple drafts as an example of an activity that requires perseverance. And then when it comes to behavior, it's remarkably different.
Totally.
Yeah,
totally. I like that. I wrote that example down too. Is that writing is, as someone who taught writing is never ending. There's no, right. I always thought I would tell my students, there actually is no such thing as a final draft. You're just turning something in.
Interesting. Can I share an imperfect leadership moment that I had as a principal in this exact sort of example?
I'd love to.
So I had two kids who got into a fight on the playground. I actually saw it from my office window because I had to run back to get something. And I looked out and I saw these two just starting to fight. And so they were brought up to my office. And I had a process, very restorative, called the peace path. And I was rushed. I didn't have time for this. We had other things we needed to do. So I was like, all right. These two fifth graders. And the peace path, the way that it works is you say, I feel whatever, however you feel in that moment for what had just happened. So Jamie, I feel upset when you punch me in the stomach. And then the person says, Jamie says, Peter, you feel upset when I punch you in the stomach. And then you take a step. Next time, I want you to keep your hands off me and use your words. Peter, next time I will keep my hands off you and use my words. Then you say what it was that was kind of frustrating. Peter, next time we're playing Foursquare, you need to tell me the rules before you just call me out. Next time, Jamie, I'll tell you the rules before I call you out. They take another step. Do we agree? If they both say yes, great. If they don't agree, take a step back to kind of keep working the issue. But if we agree, great. And then they take one more step and they shake hands and exit in peace. And it works marvelously. I loved it. It was such a great way of really both people being heard, being seen, for the adult to really facilitate. I was rushed. In this case, it was like, I don't really have time for this. So are we ready to do a peace path? Yeah. So the first kid says, Elijah, I feel upset when you hit me. And Elijah goes, Jamie, boom, and just hits him again. Oh my goodness. No time to slow down, take it. We weren't even ready for the peace path. In fact, I didn't even say, are we ready for a peace path? I'm like, let's go. We're going to do a peace path. Let's go. Come on. You guys both stand right here. And I mean, if I had looked at body language, fists clenched, face, like eyes just, oh.
So good. So good. What a great story. I love the imperfectness of that story. It makes me think of the quote, what is it? Everybody's plan is great until they get punched in the face.
So I have a friend who's a principal. Her sister was a teacher in my school. And from time to time, I'll get a text from her because we text throughout the year. And I'll get a text that says, Jonette was thinking about you. How's that peace path working?
Of course. How is it working?
Fantastic. Works great. I hope Jonette listens to this.
I'd like to know the number of other steeplemans that think it's working so great. The measure is not Peter. Oh, goodness gracious. Let's talk about that. Let's do a quick moment here on the after action review. Honestly, as I listened to it, now I listened to it twice. As someone who was an administrator at the middle school level, I'm still confused as to what they did differently. And I'm going to tell you what I think he did, and then you tell me whether I'm right. Is that okay? I want to
go for it.
We're doing like a quiz show. Did he just use basically transparent and collective responsibility? Did he make it so that others know when they're taking time?
I want to think about how I want to respond to this because I actually thought like what he was doing was terrible. So the way I understood it, basically what was happening was he was doing what so many of us do when there is one small issue with one small group and then applying it to everybody and then creating confusion. So he found himself monitoring the wrong thing and distracting from the work that he ought to have been doing as a principal in terms of building relationships and those types of things. And instead was standing there with, I don't remember, the clipboard or whatever, but basically like pen. Monitoring. Yeah. I mean, what a visual, a red pen.
Yeah.
And so how do you, it was incongruent to say, I want to bring joy and be joyful. And at the same time, I'm going to really make it difficult for, I don't know what the word is. I mean, on one side, I'm going to try to be joyful and bring joy to the environment. And on the other hand, I'm doing the absolute opposite by micromanaging to some extent, as opposed to, just really understanding how to engage and provide feedback. And I think, what he reflects on is how much he has grown over time. And then the role of a leader, whether you're superintendent or a principal, to say, like, when you mess up, you got to say that was a mistake and we're going to do it differently. And you got to be able to, own your actions. And so, yeah, I just thought he learned a lot about relationship. But yeah, I was also sort of just horrified. I'm sure he was horrified as well, just thinking about his actions of standing there and monitoring.
It didn't bring up this one question for me as a leader, currently as the leader in my own organization, as well as having been a leader of a school. When is collective responsibility, meaning the whole group is taking responsibility for the group, versus you as a leader being the heavy? When do you know?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The same thing for a superintendent. That's a hard one. I would be interested to bring in others who might want to share their thoughts on that, because sometimes you cast these sort of like general statements that leads to more confusion. Sometimes you go individually, and then that also creates conflict. But I think the rule should be people, while it may not feel great in that moment, crave feedback. And when you don't provide it, it creates confusion, frustration, false starts, anxiousness, all those kind of things. You don't get anywhere. And then if you continue not to do it, it snowballs. Actually, I was thinking about his statement about being a snowplow for others. And yet what he was doing here was, maybe he was being a snowplow and clearing the way for others. But what he was not doing was filling the potholes that he had created. And so everyone was just sort of falling into funny.
Speaking of potholes, but actually his metaphor that he uses was he sees himself as a talent manager. And that made me think of this. The talent manager is trying to make it so that the talent gets seen, is valued, gets what they need, and is also trying to have them take care, has enough trust for them to take care of themselves to some degree. But at some point, the talent manager has to be the bad guy. That's what being paid to be the talent manager is. That's the hardest part of the job, is sometimes you get to be the one that they yell at. That's the job. That's the part of being the heavy that I think most people, that's what I say about the good trouble thing, right? Nobody likes the trouble part. That's the job. Sometimes you're the one they yell at for the sake of the collective.
That's a good reminder. And if I could extend it as we close,
please.
I would say when he talked about his Leaders Go Places program, which is an extension of the restorative practices work, where there's a weekly gathering where students thank each other and apologize to each other. And they apologize to their teachers for things that have happened in the previous week. What an interesting practice that could be for us as leaders, because yes, we have to be the heavy sometimes and say some uncomfortable things. And then how beautiful it could be if we could practice that sort of restorative piece as well, of fixing or mending what has been frayed or broken. That we can do that. We can apologize to each other. That didn't feel great. I apologize. And you know how I feel. And you know how your behavior or actions have impacted all of us. And I think that could be so powerful. Hard to do, super powerful.
Peter, this is what you just said is another reason why I like you as my friend. That is exactly right. I try to practice that very thing. Be clear about what it is that you want, what it is that hurt your feelings, what it is that you need, what it is that the decision you're making for others. And then when it hurts someone else, apologize for the hurt. I am not defensive about unintended consequences. I certainly did not mean to hurt your feelings, but I did. And I apologize for that. It's not what I want. And the rule is this, you know what I think. I like it.
Here we go. They do that each week. And here's something that our listeners can do each week. They can give us 5 stars. They can put a comment in that they really appreciate the work that we're doing and the conversations we're having and the guests we get to host each week. So you've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast. Jamie, I will see you next week.
I will see you next week.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast.